Okay, in this video we're going to go through Keynes's idea of discretionary fiscal policy. So as we discussed before, right, Keynes was a big proponent of using government intervention in the economy to help an economy either recover from a recession or, as we'll see in a little bit, to also slow an economy down if it's doing really well, okay? So this idea, what he called discretionary fiscal policy, is what we'll talk about here. Now, remember, fiscal policy, again, policy just means plan, and fiscal just means basically the plan of the government. That is Congress, the legislature, or parliament, right? So fiscal, this means, of government. So, well, let me erase this and just do it this way. So fiscal policy means the tax and spending plan of government, okay? So what he's arguing is that government should be able to be discretionary. That is, they should have some say over how they implement this plan, right? It shouldn't be passive, right? So he's basically arguing for using laws or government spending, right? Government appropriations, to either increase or decrease government revenues or expenditures to increase or decrease the aggregate demand. Anyway, what all of this means is that the idea is you either increase or decrease spending, or you increase, boy, man, I cannot spell today. You increase or decrease taxes to affect aggregate demand, aggregate demand. That's the idea, okay? So that's what he was arguing government should do. They should either use taxes or spending by the government to try to either speed the economy up or to slow the economy down. So that's basically what is meant by discretionary fiscal policy, okay? So let's talk about, so it turns out there's two types. There's expansionary fiscal policy, and then the second type we'll talk about in a second is restrictive fiscal policy, okay? So expansionary fiscal policy is what you would use when the economy is in a recession, okay? So that is, it's below the long-run potential. Then you would use expansionary fiscal policy, okay? And so in this case, you would either do one of two things, or I guess you could do both. You could, one, increase government spending, right? And that is exactly what the Trump administration has tried to do with the stimulus bill that they passed that basically gives everybody, every taxpayer who earns less than $75,000 a year, $1,200, right? So the idea is to increase government spending, okay? Or two, you could reduce tax rates. That is, you could lower taxes so that people have a little bit more money. They don't have to pay as much money in taxes, and then they're likely to spend more, okay? And you would do both of these to try to increase aggregate demand, okay? So let's take a look at what that would look like on our graph here, okay? All right, so this is expansionary fiscal policy, which would be used when economy is in recession, okay? Real GDP, price level, okay. All right, so let's start off with aggregate demand. Let's go ahead and draw that in here, okay? Yeah, so we're going to draw in aggregate demand, okay? Now, again, we're doing this, we're going to make this diagram when an economy is in a recession, okay? So I'm not going to draw it in long-run equilibrium. I'm going to draw the economy in a recession, okay? So let's put in our long-run aggregate supply curve, okay? Let's put it right here. let's say somewhere right here. LRAS, okay? And then let's put in our short run aggregate supply curve, okay? Now we're in a recession, so that means short run aggregate supply curve is going to be somewhere back like this, SRAS, okay? Okay. So this is real GDP. Okay. This is our price level. Price level. Okay. And let's see. And then again, this is potential real GDP there. So this basically indicates the economy is in recession, right? We're at a short-run equilibrium that is below our long-run potential, okay? So Keynes's idea is to use expansionary fiscal policy. That is, you either lower taxes or increase spending. And again, you do either one, and the idea is to increase aggregate demand, okay? So if the economy is stuck in a recession, Keynes argued, look, here's what you do. You lower taxes or you increase spending or you do both, and you do it such that you move this aggregate demand curve back up here and you push the economy back up. We'll call this aggregate demand 2, aggregate demand 1, and you push it back into long-run equilibrium, okay? Let's call this price level 2, okay? So that's kind of what Keynes argued, and let me put an arrow here for our aggregate demand curve. So that's generally what Keynes was arguing you should do with expansionary fiscal policy, right? You lower taxes or increase spending in order to push aggregate demand out and push the economy back to long-run equilibrium, okay? All right, so now let's go to the other idea of his, which is restrictive fiscal policy. So he also had the idea, which is, okay, if the economy is in an economic boom, if things are going really well, then maybe you should use restrictive policy. And here you would either do one or two things. You would either decrease government spending, or two, increase tax rates on people, right, so that they would have less money. And again, you would do all of this in order to decrease aggregate demand, okay? So let's kind of create a diagram and see what that would look like, okay? So now, with this diagram, we're looking at restrictive fiscal policy, okay? Well, let's go ahead and label this. Real GDP, price level, aggregate demand, okay? AD. Now remember, we're making this diagram for when an economy is doing really well. So economy is in boom period. Okay? So the economy is doing really well. That means it's going to be above its long-run potential. Okay? So let's go ahead and put in our long-run aggregate supply curve and label it LRAS. And if we're going to draw this such that the short run is above long-run equilibrium, then our short-run supply curve needs to be somewhere over here. Okay? SRAS. Okay? All right, let's go ahead and label our equilibrium. Price level 1. Okay? And real GDP. Real GDP 1, right? Which, as we can see in the diagram, is above long-run potential, right? It's to the right of long-run aggregate supply, okay? So Keynes is arguing here with restrictive fiscal policy that you kind of do the opposite of expansionary fiscal policy. That is, you increase taxes or lower government spending, and you do this in order to reduce aggregate demand. Okay, so that's what he was arguing. So what that would do is that would cause aggregate demand to decrease and shift back here, AD2, okay? And then that puts you back here at a long-run equilibrium here, okay? Now, notice how kind of there's a downside of using these types of policies because notice, right, we're going to be stuck at a lower price level, okay? But that would push real GDP back to the long-run potential, okay? So that's what Keynes was arguing, was that you would basically use government tax and spending policy to either increase aggregate demand if the economy is in a recession or decrease aggregate demand if it's doing really well, to basically keep the economy around its long-run potential or its long-run growth path, okay? Okay, now, as you're probably starting to figure out, this is going to have some impact on debt, right? Budget deficits, debt, accruing debt, and if you're an American, you know we have lots and lots of government debt that has not been paid off, okay? So, in the early kind of 20th century, before Keynes, most politicians always argued for a balanced budget, right? That is, governments didn't want to have a lot of debt, okay? So what is a balanced budget? Well, a balanced budget is when a government's spending, right, is roughly equal to the money it takes in taxes, right? So government spending is equal to, okay, government spending is equal to revenue from taxes, okay? So that's the idea of a balanced budget. That is, a government only spends what it basically takes in tax revenue, right? So therefore, a balanced budget means there is no, I should say no new government debt, okay? Now, Keynes basically said, look, you got to forget about that, okay? And Keynes said, look, government should use what he called counter-cyclical policy, okay? So counter-cyclical basically means to be opposite of the business cycle, Okay, so when you see that term counter-cyclical policy, it basically means you kind of do the opposite. If the economy is falling into recession, you do something to push it out of recession, right? If the economy is doing really well, then you do something to kind of slow it down a little bit, okay? So what he's arguing is you do this kind of opposite thing to the business cycle, and then you have periods of a budget deficit for a while, but then you would have a budget surplus for a while, okay? So let's talk about each of these terms. A budget deficit, well, this is when, this is basically what most governments today have, but this is basically when government spends more than it takes in tax revenue, okay? So this is when government spends more than it receives in tax revenue. Okay? Now, if there's a budget deficit, this means you're going to add new debt. New debt. Okay? Now, budget surplus would be the opposite. So this is where the government spends less than it receives in tax revenue. Okay? Now, if this is the case, then you're going to be able to pay down or pay off debt, right? So then you'd be able to pay off debt. Okay? All right, so Keynes was basically arguing, look, you would have these periods of budget deficit where you would accrue some debt, but then when the economy is doing well, you would increase taxes or lower government spending, and then you have a period of budget surplus, and then you would pay off the debt. Okay, now, as we know today, politicians aren't necessarily keen on doing that, right? They're pretty good on racking up debt. Not so good on paying off the debt, okay? Okay, so just as we talked about on the previous slide, this idea of counter-cyclical policy, again, is government policies, that is, tax and spending policies to counteract, or, well, actually, I don't need to counteract because that's actually written down there, right? So this is government's tax and spending policies to basically counteract the natural forces of the business cycle, okay? So in recession, then you use expansionary fiscal policy. In economic boom, you would use restrictive fiscal policy. Okay, so that's the idea. You basically do kind of the opposite of what the economy is trying to do. Okay. Okay, now, a lot of these ideas of Keynes were kind of, nice in theory, but they started to run into some problems. And one of the primary problems they run into is the problem of timing, okay? Governments move slow. They're designed to move slow, right? If you read some of the writings of Thomas Jefferson and Madison and Monroe and Adams, right? They all talk about government needs to be deliberative and slow to be able to come to good decisions, okay? So, turns out government's not very good at actually implementing this economic policy, okay? Because governments often operate with a lag, right? So, what are some potential problems here? So suppose we do increase aggregate demand, but we time it wrong. Timing is wrong. Well, that would mean we're adding debt when economy is doing well. Okay? Or what if we do the opposite, right? What if we're trying to use restrictive fiscal policy and decrease aggregate demand? And we think we're doing it when the economy is doing really well, but what if we're about to enter a recession? So what if we use restrictive policy as economy is moving into recession, right? Then that would be a problem as well. So some of the issues with implementing this is that it's really difficult to get the timing right, okay? Now, over the years, governments have created some programs to try to solve this timing problem, right? And that is they've tried to create what are called automatic stabilizers. That is, these are government programs that don't need to have Congress deliberate or Parliament deliberate and set these programs up. They're already in place, so if the economy falls into recession, these programs automatically start to add money to the economy, okay? So the idea of an automatic stabilizer is that it's a government program that implements countercyclical policy without Congress having to do anything, okay? So examples of this are unemployment compensation, right? So in a recession, people file for unemployment. Okay? And when they do that, right, that naturally increases government spending. Automatically increases government spending. Okay, what about the next one I have listed here, the corporate profit tax? Well, if the economy is doing well, right? That means corporate profits rise, and therefore corporations end up paying larger taxes, okay? So corporate profits rise, and therefore this is an automatic way of increasing taxes. Automatically increases taxes, okay? Now, the same thing with and most countries, progressive income tax system, right? So the way a progressive income tax system works, if you remember, is that if I'm a low-income person, then the tax rate I pay is lower. If I'm a high-income person, the tax rate I pay is higher, okay? So if people become wealthier and the economy is doing well, they move up into these higher tax brackets. So if the economy is doing well, then people move into higher tax brackets, right? And so in a way, this is kind of a natural way to increase taxes. Natural way to increase taxes, okay? Now, some people have asked, or some people point out, maybe welfare is also an automatic stabilizer, right? So if the economy is going into a recession, maybe people become poorer, and then you have more people applying for welfare. So that's possible as well. Again, it doesn't have as big as an impact as unemployment insurance, right? Which means lots of people right now are filing for unemployment insurance, okay? So to solve that problem of lag, right, the government creates these automatic stabilizers, okay? And so these are some programs that are designed to either increase or decrease government spending or taxes to do it in a countercyclical way, okay? To try to bring the economy out of a recession or slow it down if it is doing really well, okay? Okay, now this is what we'll move on to in the next video. But a lot of these ideas of Keynes were incorporated this idea of the expenditure multiplier. So we'll get to that in the next video.